All right, folks, we're going to get started. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming to this briefing tonight with the Thomas More Society. They've got a lot to talk about. My name is Adam DeAngeli, Executive Director of the Washington County Republican Party. And our Master of Ceremonies for tonight is a good friend of mine, someone I've worked with for years, founder of first the most successful, largest Tea Party group in Michigan, the Great Lakes Tea Party, which grew into the Michigan Conservative Coalition, and which then went on to become Michigan Trump Republicans. So Marion Sheridan's been an incredibly hard worker for the grassroots all across the state of Michigan, including now in her second term as the grassroots vice chair of the Michigan Republican Party. So please welcome Marion Sheridan.
Thank you, Adam, for that kind introduction. Do I need a microphone? Yep. Can you hear me? You think I do? Yes. Do we have one?
Not one that works easily.
Okay, I have one that works really easily. Hold on.
Okay, all right.
The Uber thing, you just walk into the crowd. Filled on ears.
What?
Filled on ears. Tell me about your experience.
I never thought that I would be the kind of person that would travel around with a portable microphone and a podium wherever I go. But that's what I've become.
The people watching on stream say you sounded fine, but that might not be good for this room. So
Let's see. It's pretty good. It really is for what a little system it is. Okay. Test. Is this better?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Good evening, everyone. So we have an honored guest in tonight from Minnesota, and I'm so happy that you came to hear him talk about all the great things he's doing in Michigan. I think his talk is going to give you hope and encouragement that there are many people that are working behind the scenes on things that we care the most about. And what is that? It's election integrity and issues of education in our state. So you're going to be very encouraged by his message. So I want to tell you a little bit about Eric Cardell. He's a special counsel for the Thomas More Society. Eric graduated from Harvard and received a law degree from the University of Chicago. For the past 30 years, Eric's been in private practice, specializing in government relations. In other words, he specializes in suing the government. Eric's working as a special counsel for the Thomas More Society, specializing in pro-family, family values, and election integrity cases through Vote Legal Initiative. After college, Eric attended the University of Chicago Law School, where he graduated in 1992. He served about 10 years as a field artillery officer in the Illinois Army National Guard, U.S. Army Reserves, and Minnesota Army National Guard before retiring as captain. Eric and his wife Allison married in 1992, and they have 8 children. I first met Eric on Zoom calls when I was helping with the Secure My Vote petition initiative starting in 2021. He took an amazing interest in eliminating serial election rigging in Michigan through multi-pronged litigation strategies. Through our work together, I connected Eric with 2 key people in Michigan who are now working incredibly hard alongside him. One of those people is Patrice still here?
No.
Okay. So is Patrice Johnson. She and her husband came from Stockbridge this evening. They've been here. We've been in meetings all afternoon. So they must have left. And that's okay, because we have the other incredibly active, hardworking person, and that is Nathan Paul. So Nathan comes out of Walled Lake Citizens for Parental Choice, which was instrumental in ending the mask mandate statewide. And he was also very instrumental along with, is Kinsey still here?
She just left.
Okay. Also very instrumental in founding the Great School Initiative and winning the Walled Lake School. They got 3 people elected to the Walled Lake School Board this past election. Amazing battle. He comes from the cyber tech world, and we're just very excited that he's, part of this incredible team that's working to clean up our schools. He's working with Eric to rid our schools of rogue sex education, as they call it. So with that, I'm going to call Nathan up to give a little bit of a summary on his part in restoring our schools, and then Eric will come up.
Thank you. Make sure this thing's working over here. There we go. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about Operation Opt Out. This is a Great Schools Initiative. We are a nonprofit that was created to really work with high impact projects to transform public schools, to bring about orthodox education back into the public school systems. This is a little disclaimer for those of you who might want to publicize this without our consent. Do not do that, because we've had some of that. So we're here to transform public schools through high impact projects. The projects are really designed around three areas where we work hard at messaging. We work hard at working with legal organizations like Thomas More Society, along with providing resources for policy and that sort of stuff in school boards, like white papers and the like with that. And so our organization is really designed to kind of manage that. And we partner then with other organizations across the state. And so there's a slew of other parental organizations all over the place that we work with on that. So what I want to do is kind of show you the problem that we're dealing with. And some of you may have seen this as a video I picked up. I think it was actually out of maybe California, I'm not sure where, but I can get that information for you. But it gives you an idea of what we're facing in our schools, and maybe you've seen this or not.
Sex ed in public schools is no longer simply about the birds and the bees. And it's not just for teenagers. For example, a second grader may find themselves in a vocabulary lesson that looks something like this. And if you find it troubling that our educators believe it necessary to have a 7-year-old identify sexual anatomy in such detail, this is just the beginning. In another curriculum, students are being taught that their biological sex may not correspond to their gender identity, asserting that they may actually have been born in the wrong body. Meanwhile, the lesson teaches that traditional gender roles or gender expressions are socially constructed and have no bearing on biology. Finally, sexual orientation is the spectrum on which people identify who they are romantically and sexually attracted to. To make matters worse, students have been asked to articulate how they identify on these spectrums in front of their peers. Theories that were once limited to gender studies programs in universities are now being presented as fact in our public schools and are changing the lives of our children. But this is just a small sample of the content that is being exposed to our children. There is much more. Sexual acts and positions are being described and depicted. Traditional religious parents are depicted negatively. Students are trained to be an LGBT+ ally, and Planned Parenthood, which also has a curriculum in public schools, is presenting abortion as a normal part of life. So what is to be done?
That's where GSI comes in. We're working on trying to fix these problems. And just so you understand that this is not just a hypothetical thing, this is something that is being actively promoted from the top down. So the Michigan Department of Education is absolutely involved in this, in encouraging and actually training schools to basically engage in what we call rogue sex ed. That's any sort of sexual education outside of the normal sex ed class. And before I jump into that, how many remember having a sex ed class in school, right? And when was it? 5th grade, 7th grade, something like that. And it was primarily like a biology class. It was kind of a functional class, and then what bad things can happen if, and so That is no longer what's going on. There's a whole concept of comprehensive sex education that is now out there, which is also permeating all the rest of the classes. So it's no longer contained in a sex ed class. They still have those, but now these conversations, like they just saw in the video, are happening everywhere from the kindergartens on up. And you think it's crazy, but we have one of the training videos here is from the Michigan Department of Education. And this is a grade school teacher in Birmingham. He was the teacher of the year. Okay. So he's now in Detroit, I believe. And again, this is the MDE. This is their training video on how to go about literally performing rogue sex ed in a class.
What he does in his classroom.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rick Joseph, and I am a 5th and 6th grade teacher at Covington School in suburban Detroit, Birmingham Public Schools, and I'm outside my classroom here. One of the first things that I do to create a safe and inclusive space is to have signage outside my door. So you can see stickers for the rainbow flag and the expanded rainbow flag with transgender acknowledgement and BIPOC folks, as well as a transgender and rainbow flag out front, which sends a clear message to people walking by that this is a safe space. When you go in my classroom, the first thing you do is you actually walk over my welcome mat. It says everyone is welcome here, which reminds people that this is a place where not only you can feel safe, but you can come and talk to me if you have any questions or concerns regarding any issue related to the LGBTQ plus community. When you come into my classroom library also, what you see is this book bin here, which is a bin that features stories of characters who are LGBTQ+. It's mostly picture books, but there are, of course, a vast array of books at every level. I teach 5th and 6th grade, so these books many of them are now considered classics, like My Two Uncles. This book is extraordinary, This Day in June, which talks about the history of the gay pride movement, and Tango Makes Three. I Am Jazz is a book I read usually on the first day of school, which creates a safe and inclusive community right off the bat. And there's a real power of using read-alouds in the classroom for helping to make students aware of the fact that these are issues that we can talk about whenever and wherever, but also it's very safe and anonymous. Furthermore, students can read these books on their own independently, and they can, of course, feel free to explore any topics that they wish. So the use of classroom libraries and the use of signage are just two elements of creating a safe and inclusive space for everyone. And of course, what works for people who are LGBTQ+ works for everybody in making sure that all people, all students and adults feel safe and welcome.
And so these are classics, Aristotle, Plato, and so, all right, so remember, this is grade school. Right? This is not your sex ed class. This is just a grade school classroom. This is what we consider rogue sex ed. So before people think that, hey, we're just kind of picking on LGBTQ stuff, even though that's prevalent, the heterosexual components too are also very graphic in many of these. And all of that, it's inappropriate in a math class, right? You don't need that in your math class or any of these other pieces. So now what we found is that this is occurring, and again, being driven not only from outside organizations and the federal level and the state level, but the way they're doing it is not just through the teachers, but also through the counselors. So in our school district, the Walled Lake Schools, we received over $5 million in ESSER 3. This was that third round of funding that came under the Biden administration during the lockdowns, and that $5 million was earmarked for counselors. And this is some of what they're doing. And so another part of the MDE, they're having a Q&A session here with some of the teachers and folks in this seminar. And they're basically trying to figure out, how do we make this happen in younger and younger grades?
Actually, we had 2 people in our 4-person group that work at the elementary level that have had at least 2 kids come out. And I find that, given the school I work in at the elementary level, amazing and hopeful. Mm-hmm. And I want to be in their schools, and I want to know how they make that happen, because I'm tired of it being pushed off to the high school level. I've really had enough. So glad to hear that it's working for some people. Super happy about that.
That's awesome.
A lot of it has begun with the counseling department at the elementary level, and then, continuing into the middle school level, but also administration. We've done a lot in our school to, just raise that awareness, but mostly just have the conversation. And we've started every single conversation with, we really don't know all of the answers, but we're willing to hear everything that needs to be talked about, and then we can look for them together. So that's really worked well at our school for both elementary and middle school.
So you can see they're definitely working on trying to implement this in the lower and lower grades. There's a whole structure in place with this. We have a blog on our website. If you want to use your phone, you can just look at that QR code. It'll bring right to the website and the blog, and you can see other videos that we have on there, other articles about this, and information that is readily available for you. So, we're not making stuff up. We're not trying to scrape something up or digging out someone's private information. This is all publicly available training that they've posted that is just way outside of what is legal here. So what are we to do? That's the next big question. I know some of you are looking at that. So what we're trying to do here is we really want to work at ending rogue sex ed in Michigan schools. This is what this opt-out is. And so the law is very, very clear. It's been around since the 1970s, and it was written quite well back then. And we're just thrilled with it. And the schools, you can teach sex ed in a Michigan public school, but there's a bunch of rules to it, right? You just can't teach it anywhere. There's kind of guidelines to that. And so you have to have things like a sex ed advisory board. And this has to be made up of both parents and teachers and clergy and a bunch of things like that. That board has to give reports every other year on what's going on. That's the board that brings the curriculum to the full board for them to then accept it and say, hey, this is going to be our sex ed curriculum for the school. They can also, it has to be in a class, right? So this is not meant to be anywhere. It has to be in a class. That means in a defined classroom, defined time, location, with a trained educator that's been trained to know how to do this, not just some schmo that just says, hey, I want to start teaching this. And then it has to have the ability for parents to preview the material, and then in a simple written opt-out that the parent can write. They can write on a napkin, right? Say, I don't want my kid in the class. The state mandates that the schools have to comply with that. They're given that ability to opt their child out without any negative ramifications on this. And so the law here, kind of going through this, you can look again, here's kind of a blog post on this. It's MCL 380.1507. This gets into the details of this, talks about the sex ed advisory board there, confined to a class, as well as then the parental opt-out. So what we have done is we've created our own opt-out form. Some schools have an opt-out form, and it's for the traditional sex ed class, but it's not adequate. And some schools don't even have that. Some schools don't even have their SEAB in place. It's kind of hit or miss. So we create our own opt-out form in conjunction with the Thomas More Society. You'll hear Eric talking a little bit more about that in a moment. And this is meant to give parents the ability to opt out of the traditional sex ed as well as the rogue sex ed. So that means we're able to look and say, we generate a whole bunch of different examples of different types of rogue sex ed that are actual examples we found in Michigan schools, and just saying, hey, you can talk about sex. You can, depending on your school board and your SEAB, you can talk about just about whatever you want in a sex ed class, as long as the parents have the ability to opt out of it, right? And it's very clearly defined. And so we created our own form for parents to fill out. And so you can go to the GSI website. You can simply download the form. It's free, right? You can download the form, you fill out the form, you sign it, and you turn it into your local school. And you ask them to put it in the child's file. And then you watch and listen to make sure that they're actually complying with the form on that. And then if there's any resistance or violation of that form, report it to us, because we've developed an entire apparatus to deal with this in case a school district, for instance, says we're going to reject the form outright. You can't do that, right? So we have a process to go deal with a form rejection. And so again, go to the GSI website, say, hey, my school, XYZ school, wouldn't take the form. We have a template letter, so you can just immediately send a letter out. Here's the template letter, send it right to the school saying, hey, here's where you're off, here's the law, here's why you have to accept that form. If they still don't comply, or if you just want a GSI to start taking a stab at it, we can send a demand letter on that. And then there's a process to go through to work into a lawsuit with these. If there's a violation, they accept the form and yet they're still involved in this. Again, QR code will lead you there. First, fill out the violation form on the website. We got this all automated, so it's very, very simple for parents to handle here. We'll review that. We have a team. Actually, Katie's one of them. Hi, Katie. Everyone wave at Katie. She's one of our lead reviewers on this. And so we have a team that kind of reviews it, making sure, A, you're a real person, right? So people filling out all sorts of crazy stuff. And then really looking at, does it match the law there, and just kind of filtering out, because we're looking for to make sure we get good quality cases into the attorneys there. And so then when they go, we hand it off to the Thomas More Society, where they'll then review it, and then we move into that kind of same process there where we're taking legal action. So what we're encouraging people to do right now is get involved. You may not have a child, but you may have a grandchild. You may have a niece or a nephew, a neighbor, somebody out there that needs this. People need to know. First of all, parents don't know they have this right. And so we try to inform them. So direct them to our website on this, tell them about it. You can fill out a form and get a copy of the form and hand it out to your neighbor and say, hey, this is something that would be really helpful for you, because this sort of thing is happening. You can direct them to those blog articles that are showing what's going on the website. And we constantly keep an update of different action and activity that's going on. So that's what GSI is involved with. I thank you for your time, and I'll invite Eric up now.
Thank you. My day started great. I was in Romulus, Michigan. I was at St. Aloysius Gonzaga Parish Church, and we sang Amazing Grace. It was a great way to start the day. Thank you. And so one of the things that I was thinking about with the missionary Aloysius, that how did he operate? Well, he operated through practical reasoning, right? If you're going to be a missionary, you're going to be very practical, right? And so what I want to talk tonight about is how we as Republicans and people on the right are practical, and why that's really needed now, practical reasoning, right? And so when you look at this GSI presentation, it's down now, but by Nathan, what was evident in that? Like practical reasoning, right? I've been working with Nathan, and the idea of parents opting out of objectionable curriculum, opting their children out, that's like reasonable, right? I mean, most people would say, right, left or up or down, parent has a problem with that subject matter or that stuff, well, let the child out. I mean, there might be abuses of that in some way. I don't know. Maybe the kid signs the parent's signature name on it. Right? I've got 8 children, so I've seen a lot of things. But the point is, how do we on our side, how are we going to be practical? How are we going to show that they've gone too far in the classroom? They've gone too far with election integrity. So what is my sort of what's my experience that would lend you to listen to me about practical reasoning, right? Well, about 25, 30 years ago, I said, well, geez, I like disagreeing with judges. I'm a lawyer. Well, maybe I can represent ordinary people suing the government. Now, it could be the federal agency, state agency, could be the county, could be the watershed district, could be the drainage authority, could be the township, could be a public school, could be a public university, anything that's government. I could do that and make a living. Everyone laughed at me because there wasn't a bar of lawyers representing ordinary citizens suing the government. There just wasn't. You have a bar on the prosecution side, the criminal defense side, the personal injury side, the insurance defense side, the matrimonial sides, whatever. But there isn't a group of lawyers who set out as a group, as a profession, to represent ordinary people suing the government. Now, there are a few exceptions. There are a few eminent domain lawyers out there, so forth, but no one would offer to do it in every subject area against the government. I did. So I've had 1,000 cases, about 300 appeals, 2 victories at the U.S. Supreme Court, 2002 and 2018. So I've engaged in practical reasoning. It's tough to convince a judge, who's, by the way, paid by the government, to hold the government accountable. They're much more accustomed to, like, oh, here comes the prosecutor. I've got like a bunch of cases. These citizens are bad. And then I come in and I go, the government's bad. They're serially violating the law. And then I, of course, say, these are the most important cases because the court needs to curb the excesses of the government to protect the people. Now, I understand that the criminal lawyers say their case is the most important. Civil lawyers say their case is the most important, whatever. but these cases are important too, and I'm going to have a testament in my career that these are the most important cases. So, for what it's worth, right? I could have done other things, but this is what I've done. It's sort of like for you folks who maybe engage in general contracting projects around the house. Like I've narrowed my mind so I know how to be a plumber, right? Now I know so much about plumbing that and someone else who's a carpenter really can't even like criticize the work. So even like lawyers, can't really know enough about what I know to criticize what I'm doing. But tell you who appreciates it? Who appreciates it? The judges. The judges appreciate it because what do they say when they retire? Oh, Eric, even if they're left, right? Oh, Eric, that was one of the most 5 important cases I had in my career. Over and over again. I kind of got a career award, and all the lawyers in Minnesota didn't like it. But in 2018, I got a career award, even though I'm not near the end of my career, because you can do this kind of lawyering until you're through your 70s. But I got a career award as Lawyer of the Year in Minnesota. There were like half dozen other people who got it. I noticed that the other people who got it for one lawsuit against the government, right? Usually a lefty lawsuit against the government, right? And so they're celebrating all these lefty lawsuits against the government, and I got like a career award for like filing 300 lawsuits against the government, but they didn't like any of them, or didn't like a lot of them. So let's get back to why am I talking to you about practical reasoning? And one of the reasons is when I started, maybe this was 2003 or 2004, I said, hey, look, there might be an adjacent possible here. There might be something that I can do while I'm doing these lawsuits against the government that would help people understand sort of about practical reasoning. And so I worked with an analytical philosopher who was trained at Wheaton and at Johns Hopkins, and he taught me, analytical philosophy. And so we wrote a book. It's available on Amazon.com for people who want to take a deeper dive. But I just like to say that I'd like to describe this one paragraph here. Read this one paragraph. In Christian neopopulism as counterculture, Tom Dahlberg and Eric Kernel introduced us to a postmodern democratic political philosophy, which starts with the premise that politics is inevitably an extension of our cultural notions about the nature of reason and knowledge. And so the reformation of politics requires the reformation of the culture. Rationalist culture must be deconstructed in order to liberate us from the modern conception of government as ruled by objective truth. So one of the problems I noted what we've noted is that everyone's allowed to disagree with everybody, but you can't disagree with the government. The government will just automatically say what we're doing is true. And so we wrote a book, a philosophy to defend people who criticize the government. And it's defensible. So if you're criticizing the government, this great story. I was talking to a mayor who was a senior partner at a law firm I'd left, and he was a mayor, and I go, this was 25 years ago. I think I'm gonna represent people who come to public comment and criticize the government. And he was a mayor as well as a lawyer. He says, Mayor, I hate public comment. I'm gonna get rid of it. So imagine the idea of representing the critics of government. And that's what I've done throughout my career in order to improve the government, as opposed to going along with the government. So let's talk a little bit about what this means practically for the 2 areas I'm working in Michigan. That's Great Schools Initiative and election integrity. The Great Schools Initiative had an event at the Chaldean Cathedral, and Bishop Francis said this, and I think this is a perfect example of the practical reasoning we're talking about. He said, when I was a child, my parents could trust the school teacher. Now, today, we can't trust the school teacher, so it requires a different kind of parenting. You see all the wisdom in that? That's practical reasoning, and that's something that people can agree with. Now, listen to this other one. I'm going to flip topics on you, okay? Election integrity. Back when I was a child, my parents could trust election officials, and we didn't have to worry about it. But now election officials, we can't trust them, so it requires a different type of citizenship involvement. You see how the practical reasoning distinguishes us from the other side. It creates the arguments that we're going to need to win. And what we really need to look at is, how do we communicate a message that can win in Michigan? I'll give you another example. the philosopher that we really like, a Notre Dame philosopher, Alistair McIntyre, gave a talk on Western culture. And he basically gave a long talk, and then a very conservative a female PhD student came up and said, I came to this lecture on Western civilization and culture, and you never mentioned the two-parent family. And the elderly Professor McIntyre said, but I did. I offered 3 rules. I said, 1, family members should live in proximity to each other. 2, uncles and aunts should be involved in raising their nieces and nephews. And 3, we completely lost the custom or tradition of talking about the family. I actually gave that talk. My first of 8 children got married, and I gave that talk as sort of the part of my presentation at the reception after the wedding, and so many people came up to me and thanked me. There were like uncles and aunts and single moms who came up to me and said, thank you for including us. If we are excluding people in the first instance with respect to the public schools, we're not going to win. Parental opt-out is for everybody. Everyone can support parental opt-out, and we can aggregate people behind our agenda because of what the government's doing. By the way, on the parental opt-out, I don't know if you heard, Nathan didn't mention it. Thank you for leaving the punchline to me. So these citizens got together. They put together a good product, the parental opt-out. Parents were signing it, and we were like shocked. Whoa, the school districts are accommodating parents. That's beautiful. And it was really interesting because we thought they'd be rejected, but a lot of school districts, just like any other organization, don't like complaints. So they're making accommodations to parents. But the Michigan Department of Education couldn't abide by that. So they issued a memo saying parental opt-out forms have to be drafted by the school district. If a third party drafts the form, it's legally unauthorized and should not be honored. And at the end, they said, these third party drafted forms are invalid, irrelevant, and inconsequential. Isn't that just beautiful? And that leads to the next point, is where are we at with sort of how the arguments are going? And this Professor McIntyre wrote a book, After Virtue, in the early 1980s, and he was concerned about emotivism. Remember when a lot of you were around and the left started using emotional arguments? Well, I had difficulties reading his book 30 years later because they moved from their emotional arguments to doctrine and procedure. So remember, emotional arguments, protect these people, they're victims, to now like doctrine, like critical race theory. Before it was don't discriminate, this is an emotional issue. Now they have a doctrine they're teaching, right? And you can look at the LGBTQ issue too. He later wrote a book, Which Rationality, Whose Justice, which basically said any account of reason is based on on the view of good or justice. In other words, we all have a view of good or justice. We each have our own creed. Now the reason flows from that view of justice or good, and that's why we're having the conflicts because, oh geez, we can't communicate anymore because they have a different set of facts. They're not operating from the same logos or however you want to put it. And this is easy to understand. I mean, think about the biblical Egypt. If the journalist went and talked to the Pharaoh, everything's fine. And the journalist never visits the Jewish slaves. They report that it's just fine. And so you can have a government that disrespects the people's traditions, customs, and views. And this is where I think the parental opt-out form has hit a nerve. That's where the election integrity work has kind of hit a nerve. And so when we're working on these issues, if we work together in a practical way, we can find ways to improve the government through action politically and legally. So one of the things that's really confusing, I think, is that we were promised by Montesquieu in the Spirit of Laws, we're going to have 3 branches of government and it's going to be just fine, right? But what happens if the 3 branches of government produce results that aren't fine? Well, then it's up to the people to do something. So what do the people do? Well, people pop up and say, I represent the people. Oh, did I say that? Well, that's easy for me to say. I'm a lawyer representing people suing the government. But maybe you're not accustomed to thinking that way. Boy, that's pretty radical, isn't it? But yet the philosophers have said that is the sine qua non. That is a thing that you can't do without populism, right? So populism is I represent the people, and the government's saying, well, that's subversive because the government represents the people. So my career has threatened the government because I represent the people suing the government. It's an existential threat. In fact, has anyone heard of the VFW program, like Boys State? Anyway, there's a program. My son ended up being an alternate going to it. All these boys came in, and these politicians talked to him, and he said, well, all the talks were nonpartisan, Dad, except for this one former Minnesota Supreme Court Justice, Paul Anderson. And he gave a partisan talk about, how evil Michael McConnell was, and Merrick Garland should have got that seat, and blah, blah, blah. But I went up and talked to him afterwards. Dad, you know what he said about you? He said, son, your father, he's dangerous. And so you imagine just ideas, how dangerous an existential threat they are to the other side. And so that's part of what's going on, is that we're going to be representing the people because the government's not taking care of the people, just like Moses did, remember? And so you have to move into this position where, okay, represent the people against the government. It's not a left-right thing anymore. It's like, we got to improve things. Parental opt-out is improving things, right? And so when we work on that idea of improving the government through action, we identify ourselves as aligned with the people and against the government. And the government has been so distracted that they're instrumentalizing things here in Ann Arbor. Okay, let's just start with Ann Arbor, right? Okay, we're here. Let's start with that. So, election integrity issue. University of Michigan, Ginsburg Center. The Ginsburg Center here coordinates something called the Big Ten Democracy Challenge. That is for all 14 Big Ten universities. It organizes a get out to vote drive. They have a competition. These competitions involve each of the universities receiving 501c3 funds. The Internal Revenue Service says, oh, 501c3 funds are tax exempt. They can't be used for targeted voter registration drives. Yet the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor takes 501c3 money and targets university students for getting out to vote. They have a competition to see who can have the highest university student voting rate. And at Ann Arbor, the municipal clerks work with the public university officials who work with the 501c3 organizations to do that. Now, we're for getting voter registration applications out, but they should go out to everybody for using government resources, not just university students. And on top of that, the progressives passed a federal law saying that the public universities, for example, here at the University of Michigan, that they have to send out a communication to every student before the election. So think about that. Like the Biden administration put out a letter after putting out Executive Order 14019. The Department of Education sent out a letter to all the public universities saying we'd like that communication to the students be by email. So think about how specific that is. Okay, public university students get emails reminding them to vote, but no one else does. So those are government resources being targeted. Now, ironically, and you kind of find this in the case law, the Obama campaign won a case in the 2012 campaign in Ohio. And I'll just get to the quick. There was preferential voting options for military veterans. And so the unanimous panel said that favoring a group with voting opportunities is just as much a violation of the Equal Protection Clause as suppressing a demographic group for voting. So right here in your neighborhood here, it's kind of hard to believe that you would have like a center in Ann Arbor running 14 public university campaigns in all these swing states, right? But that's happening. And so what we look at that and we say, oh, okay, what can we do practically? Well, that's wrong because the IRS has said it's wrong. Can't sue in federal court because no private cause of action. You could file a complaint with the IRS, I suppose, that 501c3 money shouldn't be used that way. But thank God the state of Michigan has taxpayer standing lawsuits. So you can just sue the University of Michigan, the circuit court here, and you can sue them and say, look, you shouldn't be using resources in illegal ways, right? And then that holds them accountable. And what story do they tell? They tell a story, oh, we're being nonpartisan. Well, we're beyond that, right? And so one of the things of the Election Integrity Group in Michigan is we've been working together since before 2020, and we really nailed this idea of partisanship getting into the registration. Now, remember, we filed a lawsuit in Michigan Federal District Court in 2020 regarding the Zuckerberg funds. Thomas More Society, we filed 8 lawsuits nationally, 1 in Michigan. For various reasons, they were dismissed on jurisdictional grounds, and then they were withdrawn after the 2020 election. But then that was a platform working with Foundation for Government Accountability, the Center for Capital Research, to educate state legislators. And although Michigan passed a law that was vetoed, 24 states banned private money in election administration. So Zuckerberg, when he announced he wasn't going to do it again, well, of course he wasn't going to do it again. It was a crime in 24 states. So that's how we're fighting back on the right. Another example, this Michigan Election Integrity Group has worked very hard with respect to investigating with Heather Honey of Verity Vote in Pennsylvania and Ron Hoyer in Wisconsin Voter Alliance Wisconsin, the issue of the 32 states giving their private driver data to an organization called the Electronic Registration Information Center. So we were doing that investigation. We worked on it. I filed 4 administrative complaints, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Minnesota. For different reasons, only 2 got to hearing. But it was really important to get the hearing because in the hearing in Pennsylvania, the Deputy Secretary of the Commonwealth testified, Jonathan Marks, that after the written contract is signed, Eric comes back verbally and says, well, can we share the data downstream with others? And they, in Pennsylvania, they did, and they shared it with Center for Election Innovation Research. Okay, so we got the transcript of that. That's all put together. Then a few of the people aligned with us go talk to the Missouri Secretary of State a few weeks ago. It tells the Missouri Secretary of State what's going on. The red Secretaries of State get together, Republicans, they talk about it. And what's the first question they have for Eric? Will you share with us the people you're sharing the private driver data with? Remember, it's your private driver data too in Michigan. So your driver's license number, your last 4 of your social, and then add insult to injury, your minor children or grandchildren, they can't even register to vote, and non-citizens. Why do they need that in a registration program? Well, anyway, Missouri Secretary of State and the Republicans, Secretary of States brought those questions to Eric. And even though everyone knew, we knew from the Pennsylvania testimony, the information was being shared with CEIR, they refused to answer the question. Why did they refuse to answer the question? Because it would have led to more questions, right? Right. And so then those 3 Secretaries of State last week dropped out: Michigan, Missouri, West Virginia, and Florida. Then they were told at this next board meeting in a couple weeks, 5 other Republican Secretary of State are going to pull out, including Ohio and Texas, big states. Now, in the blue states where Jocelyn Benson thinks sharing your personal driver data is a good thing, we're preparing for litigation. It's going to take some time because we're investigating. Some of these departing Secretary of States are cooperating with FOIA requests so we can get more information about how they actually operate. And so we're lining things up for a federal lawsuit under the Federal Driver Privacy Protection Act, because your social security numbers, last 4, your driver's license numbers, other personal information shouldn't be shared illegally with Eric in the first place because it's because it's a violation of the law. But then to add, it makes it much worse when it shouldn't have been shared in the first place, when it's being used downstream basically for partisan efforts, you see. And so the law is very clear. There's a 7th Circuit opinion on this, that this private driver data cannot be disclosed unless there's a listed exception. And the exceptions don't include voter registration. So it includes like creditor remedies, public safety, motor vehicle safety, everything you can think of except voter registration. And so they did this with the ERIC contracts in Michigan and the other states, knowing there was a risk. They are so well funded that their transactional attorneys are fantastic. They draft these contracts and everything's fine, right? But no, it's not fine if you're not complying with the law. But you wouldn't know it from reading the contract. In fact, this second round, I'm going to switch back to Zuckerbucks. In the second round of Center for Tech and Civic Life funding, they identified like 10 pilot cities and counties. One of them was Ottawa County, Michigan. Now, we had laid a foundation here in Livingston County where I testified before the county board. And there's another county, I think it's Jackson County, Mary? Was it the other county? There's 2 counties that passed resolutions. We're not going to take the Zuckerbucks. But then Ottawa County, to their credit, was selected to get a round of Zuckerbuck funding here, like $500,000 or more, and they rejected it. So that was a victory. It was like, well, what do you mean you won't take our money? No, we're not going to take your money because it's illegal to use 501c3 funds for targeted get out to vote efforts. You can't, or registration too, targeted registration efforts. So that's a victory. But I wanted to mention this. In Madison, they took the money, $1.5 million in Wisconsin. So you read this agreement, and because we've been litigating, the agreement's a little bit sharper now. But you read it and you're like, okay, they do have this paragraph that they're going to, that the city, when they take the Center for Tech and Civic Life funds, have to use it according to the 501c3 laws. But then, like, the next paragraph lists the things they can't do with the money under 501c3, and they list like 8 things. But then they don't list targeted voter registration, voter education drives. So, oh, come on. You're misleading the city to take the money. I'm not even sure the city knows. In fact, the 2020 funding, the city councils in Michigan and in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin that were accepting the money, they just saw the grant award letters. They didn't see the underlying agreements. And why didn't they do that? Because they didn't want any criticism, right? If someone on the city council might have said, well, this is private money going to get out to vote efforts in Philadelphia, in Detroit, in Milwaukee. And they didn't want one person to criticize. So what do? You don't include it when it's voted on. And so that's how clever and well-resourced they are. And so there's an example there of, okay, when we look at election integrity and we go back to GSI, you see how I've been weaving those together. And like, practically speaking, I mean, we should be able to win on these issues alone. I mean, in other words, how are we going to unite on the right to win elections if the most important thing is to win elections and then the people we elect are going to make better decisions than them? I mean, what do we need? I mean, I guess the entrepreneurs say that we need a minimally viable product, right? And we've been testing, and people are really upset about public schools, and they're really upset about elections. And if we can just come to an agreement of like an agenda like the one I've described, where you touch everything, but you aggregate everyone on your side, there's a cleverness to that. Look at the parental opt-out issue. Can anyone really disagree? But look, the government disagrees. The MD put out a memo disagreeing. I mean, what the hell? I mean, 90% of the people agree that parents should have the right to opt out. But our government says, no opting out. Our curriculum's perfect. No parent can have an objection. Your child has to sit there. People don't agree with that. And so that's one issue. GSI, they're developing a bathroom policy. And so they're on the cutting edge of bathroom policy. And what did Governor Glenn Youngkin say this past week? There was some student asking about transgenders in the bathrooms. Looks like we just need more bathroom stalls. Because what does that do? That's about security. That's about safety. It's about privacy. Those sink areas, they should be observable from the hallway. You can wash your hands in front of others, and those stalls should be private. You know, our public schools are so dysfunctional that when we went in, Nathan went in, he went in to talk to the superintendent, about our issues. They were looking for help on other issues, like marijuana gummies in the school, right? So I think we have to listen to like to Bishop Francis, the Chaldean bishop, and we have to realize that we need a new type of parenting where we're much more active with respect to the public schools, and that's practical. It's not ideological. It's not like, oh, there's this big brand out there, conservative, and we're winning. No, we have to have a package of practical ideas to make life better for the people. And the other side is so arrogant that they're instrumentalizing our election officials to obtain systematic election advantages for progressives. They're instrumentalizing our schools to obtain progressive outcomes in the schools. Well, I mean, I'm all ears. We can add a third subject area, but I think the progressive organizations, the 501c3s, have taken these decentralized areas of our government, that is public schools and election clerks, and they haven't gone through the regular legislative processes. Rather, they've gotten into the election clerks' offices, they've gotten into the school district offices, and they're getting what they want through these 501c3s. These things aren't properly going before the school board, going before the state legislature. They're not properly going in the election matters, going before the city councils, the county boards, and the legislatures. They're circumventing. And then they have the audacity to say, we're not democratic. Oh, come on. These things don't happen in public schools and election clerks by accident. You can just follow the money. These 501c3s have been fueled by hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, both in election integrity and the public schools, and they've gotten the outcomes they want. And part of it is, we weren't responding. So on the right, I think part of it is, on the right, we really didn't have a politically sufficient response. There were problems with organizing a response. We've been divided unnecessarily. I also think that any sort of movement on the right should have a law firm. If you weren't convinced of that, look at the results the leftists had by having a leftist law firm with them. They weaponized the law, they weaponized the courts. We have to respond by that. And that's what I'm trying to do with Thomas More Society. And Michigan has been an interesting case. So one of the reasons I wanted to come to Michigan with Thomas More Society was, well, I haven't litigated in Michigan, so no one in Michigan knows me. So can I just work through Patrice and Nathan and see if these ideas work? And it really wasn't the lawsuits, it was the practical reasoning. You see, it was like, oh, wow, if the left is instrumentalizing election clerks and school districts, and they've gotten so far that they're violating people, their rights, their families, and their lives, then there should be space for us to operate. And I think it's really extraordinary. Let me give you another one. On the GSI, the third product will be something like viewpoint neutrality, which is kind of a legal doctrine, but it basically says, like, if you're going to put stuff up on the walls, you're going to fly flags, the school districts can't just be one-sided. They got to reflect both sides. And the audacity right now of the left is, like, in the Green Bay mayor, he said when he broke the tie 6-6 on the council to fly the gay pride flag, they insisted on taking down the POW MIA flag. So the POW MIA flag comes down for good, and the gay pride flag goes up for good. And he said the gay pride flag is forward-looking, and the POW MIA flag is backward-looking. So this is very aggressive, because you wouldn't have to necessarily, anger veterans or people who support veterans, but that's where they're at. So in the public schools, as we saw in the video, we got gay pride and Black Lives Matter signage and other progressive themes all over the place, in the hallways, in the classrooms. And we have groups that are objecting to those things, but they're told that they're not political. The assertion is they're not political, they're facts, right? And our side isn't listened to. For example, I want to give you an example. In Kenosha, Wisconsin, we had a case come in where the person who was elected for a 3-year term, Eric Meadows, this was on Fox and Friends a couple weeks ago, twice we were interviewed, but Eric Meadows was elected for a 3-year term in a large seat. And then he was told by the board, well, we messed up the stagger, which is vague in the statute. It's like as reasonable as practicable, but we're only going to give you 1 year. And so we contested that, And now we're working through the litigation process. But while we were doing that, we noticed that when Eric Meadows' supporters came to the board meeting, they had signs. Eric Meadows is a school board member, which most of us would say is a fact. They had a policy against political messaging, and they said, no, we're not going to hold the board meeting unless you remove those signs. And so they canceled the board meeting because they had signs like that. Now, under the same policy, a completely separate group in the same school district contacted us about the same time and said, yeah, we've been complaining about over signage with respect to the LGBTQ signs, Black Lives Matter signs, and so forth. And we complained under the same policy, but they told us it wasn't political. So it's really unbelievable, right? So it's the same policy banning political signs, political messaging. And so a conservative sign, Eric Meadows is a school board member, is not political, but these other signs, that is political, are not political. And so it reminds me of a case that I had, one of the two U.S. Supreme Court cases, and it was about political apparel in the polling place. And so the issue before the U.S. Supreme Court was, can the state of Minnesota ban political apparel in the polling place? And Justice Alito was asking questions to the government attorney, and he said, well, could someone wear a T-shirt with the First Amendment printed on it? Would that be political? And the assistant county attorney said, well, no, but that wouldn't be political. But what if you had a T-shirt with the Second Amendment on it? Oh, yeah, that'd be political. You can't vote. So, and it's funny, in the transcript, it has brackets with the word laughter in it, right? And there was actually an Internet Law Journal as a gift to its members, the Green Bag put out a coffee mug with that transcript on the side of the coffee mug, perhaps one of the worst responses ever given in the U.S. Supreme Court. But you see how the government repeats its error. So I just went through the Kenosha facts, I went through the Minnesota facts. Why is it that they have this view that when they assert political ideology, it's not political? And then when we fight back, it's political, right? There must be something wrong with their view of justice and their reason. Because in a normal operating democracy, people are allowed to have different views and you kind of work it out. But they become sort of ideological in a way that, they want to instrumentalize government against us to suppress our views. And we have protections in the United States against that. Like, I won the case in the U.S. Supreme Court 7-2. And so that's like, oh, we've redeemed the government. But why do you have to take that all the way there? Because it's such a violation of common sense. And so I think when you work through all of these things in Michigan, if we're smart, we're going to be winning. But we have to be smart, and GSI and the Election Integrity Group are doing important work. In the election integrity, Thomas More Society picked up the Michigan electors case. This was an example of sort of like, oh, we can't leave soldiers on the battlefield. We gotta protect them. So we picked up the case, but then I analyzed the case. What's going on? So wait a minute. So the Biden electors sue the Trump electors to get remedies in Michigan courts. But wait a minute. There's this electors clause, Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution. What does it say? State legislatures determine the appointment of the electors. Then you look at the Michigan compiled laws. Well, the legislature has a remedy. If you're a faithless elector, you're removed and a successor is appointed. Do we really want the state courts creating remedies against electors who end up choosing the United States president? Do we want all that litigation in all those swing states starting on November 9th or whatever it is, whatever day after election? No, let's keep the state courts out of that and just let the state legislature create the remedy. And isn't that a sensible remedy? If you're not bound by the popular vote, then we'll appoint a replacement. Otherwise, there aren't any remedies against electors, as there shouldn't be. I mean, you have the generally applicable laws, that's enough, right? But here they've been sued for what they did as electors, and nothing everything was fine. And it's just fine. And so we're proud to represent them. On Tuesday in East Lansing, we're filing a lawsuit against East Lansing. It has a law called the tenant voter law, and it compels landlords to get voting registration information to tenants. So remember, we were talking about the public University of Michigan Ann Arbor, targeting voter registration information for a progressive group. Well, here you go again. Ypsilanti has the same. So if we find a landlord there, we'll bring the lawsuit there as well. Now, the great thing about this lawsuit, in the face of the election denial type things, is that in 2020 we won under the First Amendment and took down the similar ordinances in Minneapolis and St. Paul. So we're going to be relying on the Minnesota court opinion and applying that to East Lansing and Ypsilanti. But Tuesday we'll file against East Lansing. So now that case is a good one of how clever we have to be, because everyone would say, oh, that's an election integrity law. So in fact, I was interviewed by a public relations guy for Thomas More Society, and he was interviewing me, and I was like trying to argue his election integrity case. And he said, well, Eric, how would you argue in court? The government, it can't compel me to speak to anyone. I can't be deputized to talk to my fellow employees or my neighbors. If the government can talk directly to those people, the government has to do it. It can't require me to do it. And that's how we won the first case, and that's how you beat East Lansing. That's how you beat Ypsilanti. And then eventually you want to have state law that says you can't do this, because the government doesn't compel people to talk to other people. That's part of what the government doesn't do, not what it can do. And so that's an example of how we're going to make a difference around here. So if we look at the kind of lawsuits I'm talking about right now, except for the electors lawsuit. So the lawsuit against Center for Tech and Civic Life, the Zuckerberg funding, the lawsuit against Eric for the private driver data, the taxpayer standing lawsuit against public universities for misusing taxpayer resources under the federal law I mentioned, and under its own contracts with the nonprofits, and the lawsuit against the cities for the same or similar reasons. That's all multiple state litigation. So we're going to do that in Michigan, we're going to do that in Wisconsin, we're going to do that in Pennsylvania. And so that's all practical stuff. If you sat down and you explain these things, look, do you think that nonprofits should be able to work with the government who's running the election and target certain demographics to turn out the vote? You know, sensible people would agree with us, right? Just like with the parental opt-out, that, oh, sensible people on the parental opt-out are going to agree with us. So we don't need that many of these topics, right? It's almost like, well, this is so screwed up. It invites the question, who screwed them up? Right? You know, it really, I mean, so how could the Michigan Department of Education issue a memo saying that opt-out form is invalid, irrelevant, inconsequential? I mean, then you ask the question, who the hell is running this show? And we got to get rid of them. And that's how you beat them. But we have to kind of overcome some of our differences, and we need to focus. One of the most encouraging things is that we heard a talk today from Kevin Laracy, who's from Bay City or Bay Hill, was it? Bay City. And he, he's right there. So, hey, Kevin. And one of the encouraging things is Kevin's working out how to organize so we have data about our supporters, so we can micro-target our supporters so they know what we stand for, just like they are. So I've mentioned a lot of instances where the left is violating the law, but in other instances, they're just better organized than we are with respect to collecting data and communicating to them the data. And I think that's very exciting. So what I want to do is talk a little bit more about where we go from here. And I think what I would like to see is working with the county organization here, Washtenaw County, and I'd like to work more closely with you and come back and give you periodic reports. But I think also it's time to kind of like support GSI in these election integrity efforts and realize that might be enough. I'm not saying that you don't practically engage in other issues, but what we need to do right now is organize around issues that frame your government in a bad way and then connect the dots. And there's so many targets here. I mean, I'm like, whoa, I can have a career in like 3 or 4 years in Michigan. I mean, it's just like, what happened? And I think maybe, the GOP members weren't minding the store when they were, there or whatever. I don't know. But we were taken for a ride on a lot of this. And so we have this plan to fight back and to win. And I think it's more or less just a matter of implementing the plan. So are there any questions? I take a few. Are any? Sir, why don't you go?
Well, thank you very much for your my daughter is a middle school student in the Allen Public Schools, and in the history section / social studies class, there is a progress pride flag hanging from the ceiling, and my daughter was told recently that one of the trans girls, approximately 40% now identify as trans, was saying that allegiance to trans, or to the Progress Pride flag, which is the rainbow plus BLM plus trans, and asking the teacher to remove the American flag. And he said, "Oh no, we can't do that." But I'm wondering how this opt-out form is going to eliminate all of the propaganda, because there's like this teacher of the year person. They have stickers on a lot of the classrooms, a lot of the books are BLM and trans focused. So how is that opt-out form going to take away all of that propaganda in the schools?
Eric, can you repeat the questions, because the mic's not picking up the questions?
The question is, with respect to the over signage in classrooms and the hallways in the public schools, how does the opt-out form address that? Well, in the very first instance, the opt-out form addresses it by providing a line where a parent can opt out of it. So, according to the Michigan Department of Education, it's drafted by a third party, so it's invalid, irrelevant, inconsequential. But that's like an emotional argument, right? And so, okay, let's set the Michigan Department of Education aside. But you have to admit, there's now a history, right? The history is that the GSI parental opt-out form challenged the over signage, and the MDE says, that's not valid. So then we have options now with respect to administrative complaints. We can file an administrative complaint. You're not respecting our objection to the over signage. We have options in the courtroom with respect to, I mentioned viewpoint neutrality. I think I was a lawyer in the only case in Marshall, Minnesota, a rural school district, result of a First Amendment lawsuit. The gay pride flag and other flags came down in the cafeteria. That was a result of a settlement. I do want to mention this like just real brain turner, that we decided not to advertise the case, no press release, because we feared for retaliation for the kids. Now, this is a feature of litigating against the school district, is that any sensible parent would be concerned about retribution in the environment we're talking about. So we said, we won't advertise, but these are really strong Christian families, one Catholic, one Protestant. Both actually parents, the people involved were pastors. So then we did that, but after we filed the lawsuit with no publicity, the audacity, these were claims on behalf of 7th grade boys that they couldn't be disciplined when they put together an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, take down the LGTB flag. They even got their acronym wrong. And they're in between classes, they get like 5 signatures, and they took it away from the kids, and then they investigated them like they were bullies. And then we saw all the emails. There were anti-harassment kits from coming all over this nation to this one school because these 7th grade boys didn't like the flag. And so they did a good job. They weren't disciplined, but we brought the lawsuit and we didn't have any publicity, but the LGBT community had the audacity to hold a big rally because we filed a First Amendment lawsuit. So see how strange that is? But now let's get to your question though. So I think that when we're in the position we're in, that we're doing the practical reasoning and they're out of skew with the people. They're just running with their ideological ideas, that sometimes that messaging is the way to go. So I have an acronym for this. It's claim, going backwards. Messaging, that's the most important. Investigation, because you need to investigate the government what's going on. A, for administration, the whole project needs to be administered. Lobbying is cheap and can be effective. And then courtroom lawyering, so claim. So the messaging, the idea I had for GSI, and maybe you could lead it, was what if we just had a photo project for parents and students that we collected pictures of all the leftist progressive propaganda on the walls of our schools and put it in one place and found out, well, geez, it's like 1.5 flags per classroom, or it's in this school district, or it's whatever, right? And the idea being, at what point is there too much signage? And what point do we have to trigger viewpoint neutrality? And so that's a start. What I liked about that strategy was there could be a maintenance of some anonymity, because like remember I said on the Michigan electors, we don't want to leave any soldier on the battlefield. I don't want to leave any children, on the battlefield either. I mean that's pretty rough. So I'm very hesitant to get. It's almost like you have to vet the families and you have to vet the kids to see if it makes any sense, because don't want to ruin a family over this. And we can preserve the families and win. We just have to find other ways to win. So I think if you talk to Nathan, we can develop some strategies. This on the other side, the symbol, the gay pride, the transgender flag, Black Lives Matter, whatever, it ends up being very, very important to them. But we have constitutional protections in this way, and I think we can get it into court eventually. But it might be quicker just to do the messaging, because I don't think they have the public support of this one. You have to have a campaign to kind of shame them for the over signage, and it's just gotten to be so bad that the people will support us, or maybe they want to, maybe not on the specific policy, but they find out a lot of these things in the elections. They're so well organized. But there's 25 million. They spent the left spent $25 per vote in Michigan. Like 2/3 of that money came from out of state, or 3/4. And so they have so many communications going to these people that they set the facts with respect on which the election is decided. And so we're going to have to get better channels of communication, but we can start with the messaging. And I think the messaging is the type of things that we're talking about. That, did you know how much propaganda is in our schools? Look at all these signs. And I think that's the way to fight back. I'm a lawyer, so I know about messaging. With respect to the channels of communication, though, there are people with business know-how here. That's just like business, right? I've been told it's just like business. And then, in other words, oh, you want to get the message out? What's your audience? What do you want from the audience? Do you use Facebook advertising? Do you use blogs or whatever? Businesses are doing this every day. So we need to apply business principles to politics, just like the left is, to win in Michigan. So I think we can win on that issue. I've won in one school on one display, and I'm still standing. But my clients are, but there's risk involved. Go ahead, sir.
I was just thinking, in 1995, rectors and visitors of the University of Virginia, in a case in the High Court, talked about violations of the First Amendment rights of individuals when government overreaches. I'm wondering, right now, Dr. John MacArthur is on the front line in California with the Masters University and his church in Southern California. And I'm wondering what can be done in Michigan as California goes, the other states go. And with Michigan, what can we do? My grandmother used to talk about, she was a Rosie the Riveter here at Little Run. And she used to talk about, we learned from the Bible in the 50s, back in the public schools. What can we do to get the Bible back into the public schools?
Right. Now, John MacArthur, Thomas More Society represented him because of his positions during COVID and closing the church. And some very good lawyers, Chuck Lemandry and Paul Jonah, prevailed in those cases. This might be something more recent, but it was a real honor to represent him and his congregation as they stood up and continued to go to church. And we did a lot of church closing litigation. It seems like the progressives, they wouldn't want a crisis to go to waste, right? And so they use that as a way to basically go after people. On the wind down of that, the churches, because of the Thomas More Society and other organizations, the churches got opened a little quicker than the rest of things, So that was kind of that was an example of right of center 501c3s doing some good. Go ahead, ma'am.
Yes, you mentioned that this Tuesday, you're gonna be in East Lansing,
Right.
where I live.
Right.
With the tenant voter loss situation, you're presenting a suit for that, is that right?
That's right. We're gonna drop a press release, and we're
Okay.
filing it in the U.S. District Court for the Western District.
Okay, great. What can we hope to look for, like a timeline after that happens Tuesday?
Yeah. So the government will answer now. A lot of times, the government will quit. So I wouldn't be surprised just because of the fact that, I see these lawsuits out till the end, like 10 years, where they just kind of give up in light of the Minnesota decision. But if they don't, then, we'll eventually have a hearing and a motion to dismiss, and then we'll figure out how it goes. But yeah, probably a 9-month, take from beginning to end, 9 months. I want to mention one thing. You may be saying, how can the guy do so many lawsuits in his career? I generally avoid fact-intensive lawsuits. So in the course of my, hundreds of lawsuits, I haven't done much discovery, because if you have he said, she said disputes, that can take up a whole year. If I took one commercial case that had disputes about the facts, then I couldn't do 25 lawsuits like this against the government. So by making that decision year after year after year, I get to do all these lawsuits. So if you think about it, all the lawsuits I mentioned, the multi-state strategies, it's what I might call asymmetrical lawfare, in the sense that the litigation isn't that expensive. I found out early in my career, if it costs a dime, maybe the client will do it. If it costs $1, they won't. If it costs $10,000 versus $100,000. And so by finding disputes with the government that are on legal issues, it doesn't mean you can't tell your story, but you don't have to do discovery and stuff. So the story over at Ann Arbor, when we eventually sue the University of Michigan, is that the story will be, how crooked this is, that public officials work with the election officials, the local clerks, work with 501c3s. They publicly say the goal is to get the university student voting rate up. Well, why are we using government resources dedicated to that when there are a lot of other people in Michigan? And so look, voter registration applications are available online. You can pick them up at the clerk's office. The same rules should apply to everyone. Why would the government be introducing this partisanship in the registration system? Sir?
2 quick questions. When you file those cases and you win them, basically quickly, does the government pay you fees and costs, basically?
No, the question is, how do I get paid? And so Thomas More Society is the sponsor. It's a $15 to $20 million nonprofit, and they added in 2020 election integrity as a subject area, and so the donors are giving to Thomas More Society, and I'm providing these legal services, and so that's how we get paid.
And then also in the schools, all this rainbow, transgender, gay education, isn't it really just pornography? And shouldn't it be removed simply because it's pornography?
That's a wonderful question. The question isn't the focus on the LGBTQ sex education curriculum really just pornography? And so the way that I would respond would be, there's a language that we ordinary people are accustomed to using, and then there's this language that these progressives use. And so we're using two different vocabularies. Okay, so you might say, oh, that's a strange way of looking at the world, but that's what I wrote that book about. Neopopulism is counterculture. My co-author and I wrote a book about this. That basically, the meaning of a word is determined by its use. So when we wrote the book in 2008, some of you folks might have disagreed, but now we've had this big dispute over the word marriage. Okay. So the meaning of that word is determined by its use. Two people on either side of the question could be meeting over here, having conversations, and you read the transcripts. You say, well, they're in agreement. Well, no, they're using the word marriage differently. So you see how you can have disagreements about the meaning of a word, and that's a big part of it. So when you go to a word like pornography, their response is going to be, that's not pornography. Our response might be, it's pornography. But that's how these disputes play out. There's disagreements about meaning of words. Now, on the vocabulary point, that they have their vocabulary, the government has its vocabulary on that, and we have our vocabulary. You have just this great example, Exhibit A, in the Michigan Department of Education letter, if you haven't read it, saying third-party drafted parental opt-out forms are not to be honored by school districts. Parents have to use the school district forms if they have one, or they should have one that should be used. And then at the end, they say that third-party drafted form is invalid, irrelevant, inconsequential. And so what they're saying there is if you don't use the government's vocabulary, you don't have any rights. And so I don't think that's a jump. I think that's just practical, right? I think I'm speaking practically to you that when the Michigan Department of Education drops a bomb like that, they're saying, use our vocabulary. Well, I'm just a parent. I don't want my kid to go to that class. Use our vocabulary. You can't have that. And so that's how bad it is. And I think when we're talking this way amongst friends, I think this information I'm giving you tonight is just so dynamic. If we can share these facts and these stories with others, that's why I'm kind of saying that, you got enough in Michigan just with these, like on the GSI, you got parental opt-out, you got the new bathroom policy that's coming, and 3, you have the viewpoint neutrality that's on the signage and the posters that are on the flags we're talking about the schools. I mean, that's a lot to talk about, and GSI is here to help you as the county GOP unit to talk about it. So it's just, oh, well, GSI is doing the work. We just got to get it out. And I think here in this Washington County, that we have a chance to do something special with the University of Michigan. I mean, this is really a special school in the way it's been weaponized by the left. Now, I know it's tough to sue the university. I've been told by university officials, Eric, Mr. Cardall, that you and the University of Minnesota, that's for unity. So everyone's supposed to be unified, right? Now, University of Michigan, Michigan State, they are global boasts for your state. They have global reputations. So the way I'd go into court is say, Judge, the University of Michigan has a global reputation. It's one of the global boasts for the state of Michigan, but that means it has to be 100% legally compliant, and it's not. And this is an opportunity for you in this county. All these 501c3s are complaining about University of Michigan and similar schools. Oh, they're woke. Oh, they're this. Oh, they're that. Well, it's all indirect, my friends. They're all saying indirectly the University of Michigan is politicized. We have a direct case. They've turned the University of Michigan into a get-out-the-vote center for the left. How could it be more direct? I mean, the chutzpah of them using 501c3 funds and taxpayer funds to turn that university into voter registration drive, get out the vote center is just beyond the political and legal pale. I think it's like beyond the political pale. And we shouldn't have let it happen. Is there a question?
Yeah, okay, a comment on first what you just said, but that's not what's on my mind. The comment about the University of Michigan turning out the students in numbers beyond all belief, that made the Ann Arbor News big time. It was just pushed up really big in the newspapers that it happened. On the John MacArthur point, there seems to be some kind of a carryover coming on to Michigan. That law that the legislature passed the other day, the Elliott something or other.
Larson.
And well, there could be problems with the CRT and such like coming into our schools because of this foolishness that's going on with this Elliott Larson law. Are you conversant with that?
Yeah, go ahead. Give me a quick summary. I heard Pastor Marion.
Yeah, she seems to be on it. Are you got more on it than her?
They're attacking the Catholic schools and the religious schools where somebody could come in that wants to be hired because maybe they want to teach the gay lifestyle or they're homosexual or whatever. And then they can say, well, you're violating my rights, but they're violating the First Amendment freedom of religion. So,
Right. So the question relates to a recently enacted Michigan law that regulates private education, private schools, hiring, and so forth. Yeah, of course, we're interested in that. Thomas More Society, the subject areas include religious liberty, pro-life work, the public schools, family life, and election integrity. And so that would be just, yeah, I mean, if that's what the law says and they're going to enforce it, let's defend those schools. In those situations, a lot of schools contact Thomas More Society, and we're willing to represent them, sir.
Yeah, good question. I have a long time interest in elections. It dates back to the 80s, the mess that our registration lists are and that sort of thing. So the 2020 election really interested me. One of the first things I found out when I dug into it is that there's one set of laws for cities over 700,000 in Michigan and another set of laws for the rest of us. And this sort of shocked me. And this all leads to the hoo-ha that went on at the TCF Center and that sort of thing. This seems to me to be a real simple case of the type that you are saying that you're interested in. Those don't require any data. The law itself creates a class of citizens, those that live in Detroit, and their ballots are counted one way. Then there's the rest of us, and our ballots are counted a different way. And it seems like that's just a blatant violation of equal protection. I'm curious if you've ever come across that.
No, great question. So the question is, how did we get to a place where the ballots in Detroit are counted differently than in other places? It'd be Detroit and the other big cities, right? And so in this way,
there's only one city in Michigan that's over 700,000.
well, okay, Detroit.
You could even argue that the census says that Detroit doesn't even qualify. This is an old game in Michigan, and there are hundreds of things that are that way. The law is written so it's only cities over 700,000. And so if I live in Ann Arbor, my absentee ballot has to be counted a certain way. If I live in Detroit, it's counted a different way. Now, the real reason for that is that the city of Detroit is totally unable to organize itself to count the ballots. And they need to have some imposed system that's different from everywhere else. It seems to me like that's a lawsuit waiting to happen. Equal protection. It seems like the Michigan law is illegal.
Yeah, I'll look at that. And I've looked at some of these issues. I think that there are also bigger problems than that. When the CTCL money came into Michigan in 2020, it was they flooded the major cities, Flint, Lansing, Detroit, others, and then they were requiring absentee ballot curing, different absentee ballot spoliation issues. So maybe that can be packaged together. One of the things that I've noticed with respect to state election officers like Jocelyn Benson is that, you know, your red clerks, they're very patriotic and they follow the law. But part of the system is they appreciate them following the law because that means rejecting an absentee ballot when it's incomplete. But they're very happy in the blue areas that there be that voters are allowed to fix these ballots, you know, absentee ballot curing with, or election officials are fixing them without rejecting them. And so if you'd imagine that equal protection violation you're talking about, they play our red clerks like a song because, oh, you're going to do it that way, which is the legal and right thing to do. But then they allow and authorize the preferential treatment of the urban residents ballots. And so you're correct, that's part of their game plan. And it was played out through multiple swing states. And that's just what they did. So the law is one problem, but you have 501c3s that are fueled with resources and planning that are doing it across the urban cities in the swing states. And that's one reason why we're upset. Now they would say, well, even if I, like in a back room, they'd probably say, well, even if it's illegal, if House File 1 had been passed, it would have been legally authorized. So they're part of their strategy is to violate, they have the agencies violate the law while they're pushing the legislature fixes to the law to bring their otherwise illegal behavior into conformity with the law. And we see this quite a bit, and that's part of the way they operate. And maybe we don't copy what they're doing. We have to have officials that follow the rule of law, but we need to point out when they're doing that because they're just killing us. And one of the strategies we used in Wisconsin was the Election Integrity Group, Wisconsin Voter Alliance, was emailing, we got the addresses of the clerks, emailing the clerks when the Wisconsin Election Commission was violating law. And then the listserv would blow up because the red clerks, oh, geez, they are violating the law. At least it made it more difficult for the state election authorities to get away with it. And there was an earlier meeting, one of the clerks attended the meeting, and they said, she was basically saying the red clerks need to join in Michigan to point out when Detroit and the other cities are violating the law, because they have credibility as clerks. They're running their elections lawfully. So they should point out, oh, there you are, and then point it out. That can have success. All right, thanks, Marion.
So thank you so much, Aaron. So I just want to bring to everyone's attention that Tim King is a member of your Washtenaw Republican group, right?
Yep.
Many of you know Tim King?
Yes.
Okay, so Tim King is a Trump elector. And I am a Trump elector. And I just can't tell you how appreciative we are that the Thomas More Society stepped up to our defense, because we were soldiers that were left behind. So you've heard about all the great things the Thomas More Society is doing for us in Michigan. It's like we were left out in the wilderness and no one was doing anything for us, but they've stepped up because they're not going to leave us behind. So I just want to appeal to you. If you want to help, if you're happy, if you're like, encouraged by Eric's message, and he brings the message of what the Thomas More Society is doing for us in Michigan, please donate to the Thomas More Society. Now, this isn't Ann Arbor. This is the Thomas More Society that's based out of Chicago. But, if you want to give money to something that is doing something and is most worthwhile, it's like I want to strongly encourage you to look up and hit the donate button for the Thomas More Society. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and hopefully another time when Eric is back in Michigan, we can have him come back and visit and give you more updates on what's going on in Michigan. Yes. So thank you. God bless. Have a safe trip home.